Viewers like you make this program possible. Support your local PBS station.
Los Angeles, February 8, 1915. 3,000 people crowd into Clune's auditorium to watch a motion picture being promoted as the greatest ever produced. Within weeks, it will be the first movie to be shown inside the White House under its new name, The Birth of a Nation.
Cinema is so important to American popular culture, the grand spectacle. And this is where people go to see their fears and fantasies realized. It's also where they go to learn history. It's probably the single most important medium in American popular culture. And D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation was the single most important American film in early cinema. But the film is about history, writ large. It's about the Civil War and Reconstruction and the nation, the birth of a nation. It just so happens that the American nation has to be born out of white supremacy.
Birth of a Nation has the flaws of being terribly racist, of being historically inaccurate, propagandistic in a way that jeopardized the lives of Black people. But it was also the most pure, honest, unfiltered distillation of white racial thought at that time.
I got interested in the story when I was reading about William Monroe Trotter, a radical newspaper editor, a civil rights leader here in Boston, Massachusetts. And I didn't know very much about him. And I felt like, I should. I'm based in Boston, I'm a journalist, I'm interested in civil rights. And here's this guy who was part of all of that in the early 1900s. And I came upon his protest against America's first blockbuster film, The Birth of a Nation. He was at the forefront of this amazing, intense, and dramatic battle against the movie that played out for more than 3 months in Boston. And that was my aha moment, because I said, this is the story to tell.
This story, overshadowed and nearly forgotten in the wake of World War I, pits the radical newspaper editor, William Monroe Trotter, against D.W. Griffith, father of Hollywood cinema. In the spring of 1915, these passionate, driven, and flawed men reignited the tensions of the Civil War in a battle over race that will culminate in a showdown on the streets of Boston.
Are you ready? Are you going to demand We're going to demand to see the birth of a nation.
Boston is really the birthplace of freedom. African Americans had been fighting for their rights since the 1600s. This history of abolitionism, radical abolitionism, continuing struggle against the rising tide of the Klan in the South, most of this was coming out of Boston. In that regard, Boston was a magnet for skilled workers, skilled African American workers. It was a magnet for those who were themselves activists in their hometowns, but fearing, of course, the noose.
William Monroe Trotter was born in 1872. Both of his parents were the offspring of white slave masters and their black slave mistresses. In the 1850s, Trotter's parents fled the South for Ohio, a free state and common destination for former slaves. With the outbreak of the Civil War, Trotter's father, James, moved to abolitionist Boston to join an all-black regiment fighting for the North.
When the war comes to an end, his service, the fact that he becomes an officer, that he knows many of the white abolitionists, helps him move from having been a teacher in Ohio to essentially becoming a real estate magnate in Boston, and becomes quite wealthy.
James Trotter set a high bar for his son Monroe. He taught him to suffer no insult and to take pride in his family's origins.
One way that James Trotter looms in the mind of his son was around this idea of really being the best that one can be. And as a result, William Monroe Trotter, an all-white neighborhood, an all-white school, ends up being the valedictorian of the school, is also elected class president, and then manages to go off to Harvard. There weren't too many African Americans getting into Harvard in those days.
One of his few fellow black students at Harvard was W.E.B. Du Bois, destined to become one of the most famous men of the 20th century.
W.E.B. Du Bois and William Monroe Trotter, they were both men of the book who embraced the life of the mind. They were geniuses. Neither saw himself as an island. They really thought that their fate depended on the collective rise of other African Americans.
They navigate the Ivy League experience together, even falling for the same girl, Deanie Pindell.
Geraldine Louise Pindell came from a politicized family. Both parents were light-skinned, as was generally the case for elite and middle-class African Americans in Boston. They tended to be of mixed heritage.
Deanie has known Monroe since childhood and is drawn to his fire and intellect.
He was the first African American at Harvard to get a Phi Beta Kappa key. He graduated magna cum laude with a master's degree, all in 4 years. He was someone that other students were drawn to. He had a power about him, an understanding of the larger political situation where maybe many of his other students did not have quite the same level of understanding.
Harvard was an inspiration to me because it was an exemplar of true Americanism, freedom, equality, and real democracy. Each individual was taken on individual worth, their capability, and their ambition.
Smoke?
Oh, thank you.
Is that D.W. Griffith?
Yes.
Looks all right, doesn't he?
Sure, he's all right. He made the birth of a nation.
D.W. Griffith is a son of the South, born in Louisville, Kentucky, and grew up in Kentucky.
When you made the birth of a nation, did you tell your father's story? Well, after you mention it, perhaps I did.
His father fought for the Confederacy in the Civil War. Roaring Jake Griffith, he was a lieutenant colonel for the Wild Kentuckians. He had grown up to that point hearing his father tell stories about the Civil War and the Old South in a very romanticized way.
Oh, I suppose it began when I was a child. I used to get under the table and listen to my father and his friends talk about the battles they'd been through and their struggles. And those things impressed you deeply, and I suppose that got into the birth.
My obsession with Griffith over the last 40 years. I've been researching him ever since I was 19 years old, trying to piece together his life. The man created the art form of motion pictures, and nobody cares because they only want to remember him for one movie. Griffith is born 10 years after the Civil War. His introduction to the Klan is folklore. The farm he grew up on is not the plantation in The Birth of a Nation. He doesn't have a father you can look up to like The Birth of a Nation. There's no happy colored working in the fields, eating watermelon and singing happy. This poverty written. The Griffith family, from the time he's 14 years old, is considered white trash in the South.
You feel as though it were true? Yes, I feel so. You know, and you've heard your father tell about fighting day after day, night after night, and about your mother staying up night after night sewing robes for the Klan. The Klan at that time was needed. and serve the purpose. Yes, I think it's true. But as Pontius Pilate said, truth? What is the truth?
By the time Griffith's 10 years old, his father dies, drinking, and his family is in poverty. But Griffith now wants to be a great writer. Then he works in a bookstore, and everybody in the local bookstore who's coming to visit are artists, actors. From there he sees, to be a great writer, you have to be an actor to learn your craft. Now, something exciting is happening in the world after the Civil War. People can now travel the country for the first time. So what happens? Acting groups are getting together and they're traveling. So from the age of 14 till almost 30, he is broke traveling the country, learning to be an actor and eventually a playwright.
By the 1890s, he was an aspiring stage actor. That's what his dream was. Problem was he wasn't all that talented. He was struggling, he needed money, and there was this sort of new thing that was gaining a foothold, the front end of a media revolution. Nickelodeons were underway, these very short films, and some friends of his said, you ought to take a job acting on one of those, because the money's decent and you need work.
The first motion pictures were not meant to be projected on the screen. They were looked at in peephole kinetoscopes. One of the things that's really interesting about those films is that all the performers are treated the same. A huge number of those films were of dancers, including African-American dancers. And there's a certain kind of equality. But then something happened with the arrival of projection. Suddenly you had a different kind of film. Films of black chicken thieves, tracked by bloodhounds, in which a black criminal is lynched. A whole range of cliches that suddenly appeared on the screen. And they appeared all at once. So the beginnings of cinema really began at the same moment of Plessy versus Ferguson, which involved separate but equal, the institution of the Jim Crow. So you really see that in these early films.
As the Supreme Court is ratifying racial segregation with the Plessy versus Ferguson case, African American leadership is undergoing a dramatic change.
1895 is an incredible year. Trotter and Du Bois both graduate from Harvard. Frederick Douglass passes away, and Booker T. Washington takes his place, all in the same year. With Washington, it begins with this speech he gives in Atlanta, a speech that had people standing in the aisles, clapping their hands.
Washington argues that African Americans should accept racial segregation as long as they are permitted to pursue educational opportunities and economic development with equal protection under the law.
You won't run for public office, you won't vote, you won't engage in politics, you'll just keep your head down and work. White America loved this. As Trotter begins to watch the growing power that Booker T. Washington has in the nation, but whose rhetoric is one of African Americans not demanding their full and equal rights, he realizes that this man is not speaking for all of Black America. He might be speaking for the 90% of African Americans who are living in the South, but he's not speaking for those African Americans who are classically educated.
As Trotter's political perspective evolves, so does his personal life. On June 27, 1899, he marries Deanie. The newlyweds moved to Jones Hill in Dorchester, a predominantly white Boston neighborhood.
I think at the point in which Deanie and Monroe Trotter married, they really expected to have that perfect life of the elite.
After the 1896 Plessy versus Ferguson case, segregation creeped into all corners of the country. Eventually, Trotter began to feel the sting of segregation as it closed in on Boston.
So Trotter, up until this point, has really only experienced the best of what America could really offer someone, only to find that all of that stops when he gets out of the Harvard bubble. When that bubble bursts, that's when he becomes more radicalized concerning race politics in Boston.
The conviction grew upon me that pursuit of business, money, civic, or literary position was like building a house upon the sands. If race prejudice and public discrimination was to spread up from the South and result in a fixed cast of color.
Determined to make a difference as a voice for equal rights, Trotter develops beliefs increasingly at odds with the establishment leader of African Americans.
That was what fueled his founding of the Guardian newspaper. And they began to challenge Booker T. Washington.
On November 9, 1901, Trotter and friend George W. Forbes published the first issue of The Guardian. The masthead lists William Monroe Trotter as managing editor. The editorial page features the motto, "For every right, with all thy might."
Trotter is becoming more and more disgusted by Washington's direct interventionist politics, meaning he doesn't like criticism, so he's trying to influence newspapers and what they will write about him. But you can never underestimate the power of ego in all this. Mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the greatest Negro of all? Is it going to be Washington? Is it going to be Du Bois? Or the first black member of Phi Beta Kappa from Harvard University, William Monroe Trotter?
In 1903, Booker T. Washington comes to Boston to give a big speech. 2,000 people jammed in this church. And Trotter has prepared these 9 questions, embarrassing questions, to ask Washington.
In your letter to the Montgomery, in your speech before the Century Black men must distinguish between the freedom that is forced and the freedom that is a result of struggle. Don't you know you would help the race more by exposing the new form of slavery? Are the rope and the torch, all the races to get under your leadership?
Trotter gets on top of a chair and begins shouting at Washington, but at the same time other people are shouting. Someone throws cayenne pepper on the stage. Folks are sneezing and screaming. Fights are beginning to break out. The police come and begin hauling people away. The Washington faction press charges. Trotter ends up spending 30 days in jail. Deanie is watching her husband go through all of this at the same time that Du Bois and his family is staying with them. Now remember, this is 1903. In 1903, Du Bois also publishes The Souls of Black Folk, which essentially criticizes Washington. Du Bois is slowly becoming convinced that this neutral stance he had been taking has to change.
Joining together in opposition to Booker T. Washington, Du Bois and Trotter head to Niagara Falls to found a movement with other black intellectuals. These 29 men have chosen the falls intentionally as a symbol of the mighty currents of change the group wants to bring to American race relations. Although Du Bois and Trotter agree on objectives, they disagree on the methods of implementation. As the Niagara movement becomes the foundation for the NAACP, Trotter leaves to pursue his own politics of direct action.
At the point in time that Griffith in 1908 is at Biograph, the most exciting film is The Great Train Robbery. That has somewhat of a storyline. The only thing people are seeing are shots of little funny scenes. That's where Griffith comes in.
The early days of film, they're all silent movies. And he had a sense that he had to do more with the camera because there weren't words. He was a great innovator in that regard. He's been credited with introducing, if not inventing, a number of film techniques.
What Griffith does is he tells stories brilliantly by editing. This is very influential.
He's the conductor, taking every technique that's been around since the beginning of motion pictures and putting it into a storyline.
The audiences reacted to that because it enhanced the drama.
He found stars, Lillian Gish, Mae Marsh, and even Henry Walthall. So he had a remarkable cast.
Once he got involved and was directing and became an accomplished filmmaker of these shorts, that wasn't enough for him. He saw and imagined film on a much larger scale. And he was incredibly ambitious. He wanted to take this new medium and elevate it to an art form.
As a filmmaker, he's trying to have an effect. What he's trying to do is reach an audience. And what filmmakers are beginning to learn in the early 20th century, psychology, getting into people's imaginations, getting into their fantasies is the best way to get them to identify with what they see on screen. The films that you remember are the films that make you feel something. And one of the things you feel most strongly is fear and terror. If I put them on the big screen, oh, I'm gonna have a connection. You're gonna come back. You're gonna wanna see this.
In 1913, while Griffith heads west with big ideas about entertainment, Trotter is focused on what's happening in the nation's capital. The previous year, his newspaper, The Guardian, endorsed Woodrow Wilson. As the first Southern president since the Civil War, Wilson pledges to give African Americans a fair deal. But when he takes office, he appoints 5 Southerners to his cabinet who segregate white and black workers.
Federal agencies and offices were segregated in ways they hadn't been before. Trotter was understandably very upset about this. In 1913, he led a delegation that included Ida B. Wells, who was another very prominent civil rights leader, to a meeting at the White House with the president to complain about this backsliding to the introduction of Jim Crow in national government.
Wilson reintroducing Jim Crow. That's what really galvanized people. It was so egregious. Putting up screens between black and white workers in a federal office who had been working together. It was horrific.
They brought along a diagram of the different federal agencies that had become segregated under Wilson's watch. It was a diagram drawn by Monroe Trotter's wife, Deanie, after she had researched what was going on in Washington. So they had a meeting. Trotter came away under the impression that Wilson would do something about it. Fast forward a year later, not only had Wilson not done anything about it, it had gotten worse. So in the fall of 1914, Trotter wanted a second visit, a follow-up. And he got that in late November. He was back in the Oval Office with the president and with a small delegation of people. He began talking frankly and firmly to Wilson about his disappointment and about Black America's disappointment.
Mr. President, we come to renew the protest and appeal represented just a year ago. For 50 years, white and colored clerks have been working together in peace, harmony, and friendliness. Soon after your inauguration, segregation was dramatically introduced.
Trotter was just presenting his case. He wasn't going to back down, even if it was the President of the United States. And suddenly he was catapulted back into the national stage and the front pages of newspapers everywhere.
Trotter thought that he had the intellectual heft and the credentials to go to the White House and speak to Wilson man to man and tell him he had made a mistake. And Wilson looked at him like, "What language are you speaking? Boy, you're talking to me? Your ass is out of the White House." And you have to imagine the toll that must have taken on William Monroe Trotter.
By the time the year 1914 comes around, Griffith is truly, if not at the top of his game, very close to it. He's looking for a big story to tell. It was a friend who told him about an amazingly popular novel that was written a few years earlier called The Klansman by a writer named Thomas Dixon.
The Klansman was a massive bestseller. It is that book that eventually is made into a stage play and a drama. It even caused some riots and mob protests.
The play on which Birth of a Nation was based, The Klansman, had produced race riots. I mean, there was a precedent for being concerned about this particular story.
When Dixon and Griffith finally meet in New York City in 1909, that book has been a massive bestseller, a very popular stage play, And it is not only a celebration of the Ku Klux Klan as this noble crusade to save the South and the country, it is a viciously racist, violent advocacy of doing whatever it takes to hold black people down, to thwart their intentions, and when they get out of their place, to kill them.
By the late summer of 1914, Griffith is risking his reputation and financial ruin, investing thousands of dollars in the film. Under the blistering California sun, Griffith commands a massive production army to produce the motion picture that is still called The Klansman.
The way Griffith works, he does very extensive rehearsals before shooting even starts. Because you're dealing with what Griffith sees as miscegenation, Lillian Gish, with her long mane of fair hair, fragile blonde, looks much better when measured against George Seidman, who's going to play the mulatto threat, Silas Lynch.
The interesting thing about the racism of the film is the most dangerous thing being the half-breed, because he has the intelligence of the white man, but all the evil brutality of the black man. So many complex racial arguments going on with stuff like that. How do you define race? Race doesn't exist scientifically, but once you introduce the idea of racism, you can't remove it.
One of the things that racial pornography does is it makes people's fantasies literal. It puts them up on the screen and it says, look, you can actually see a picture of this. What you have in your mind, it's like this. That's the real danger. You think that your fantasies can be materialized. This kind of racist pornography becomes people's vision of real life, that they can't see what's in front of their face because of the filter of that pornographic imagery of blackness. You think that black people really are as scary as you imagine them to be, and that if you happen to shoot one, you're acting in self-defense, and even in the defense of civilization.
The opening of the film begins in California, and Griffith hires the Philharmonic Orchestra to come in to do the score. Picture you're sitting there, it's just not the imagery on the screen when this starts. You're caught up right into the movie with a 120-piece orchestra playing. You want to get up and start killing somebody. You can't help it.
The first scene of the film is the intertitle, which says, "The bringing of the African to America's shores sowed the seeds of disunion." That's the first villain in the film. Not slavery itself, but the African. The next scene shows you the abolitionists. And then you launch into a happy scene of the before the Civil War, with Way Back Along a Swami River playing in the background. And you see this idyllic scene of what's called a quaintly life that is no more, Southern life on the plantations.
There's really two big acts, and the first act is the Civil War. And telling the story of the Civil War dramatically through the lives and the interactions of two families. The Camerons from this fictional town of Piedmont, South Carolina, and the Stonemans from the north. They've known each other before the war. There's friendships, there's romances. The war tears them apart. Part two is by far the most controversial. In Griffith's view, Reconstruction in the South was a disaster.
Under Reconstruction in Griffith's fictitious South, freed slaves used their new legislative power to pass the most terrifying law imaginable. Blacks now have the right to marry whites. And the savage black lust of Northern soldier Gus is unleashed on the little sister Flora Cameron. While the seething carpetbagger, Silas Lynch, preys on Elsie Stoneman. The Ku Klux Klan must restore racial order through blood vengeance.
Birth of a Nation, at a time of 1950 when it came out, you have to remember silent film was relatively new. Sound was something that you weren't supposed to really think of, but it was meant to enhance the experience of the film. Griffith, when he was working on the film, thought it would be really wild to repurpose Wagner's music, especially stuff like Ride of the Valkyries. That got transformed into a piece called Ride of the Klansmen. Wagner was an anti-Semite. His racial politics by our standards would be Neanderthal. He was viewed as the epitome of the refined composer of Europe. D.W. Griffith putting him as a soundtrack to Birth of a Nation, this was a high cultural statement. And we can see where that went.
The film's hugely successful LA premiere revolutionizes motion pictures overnight. For the first time in history, a sophisticated marketing campaign lures audiences in droves.
Now, if I was a fly on the wall, it would be really interesting to be out in California when the heads of the NAACP walked out and saw for the first time posters of the Klan posted all over the walls. It's the 50th anniversary of the Civil War, and you think they're honoring the Ku Klux Klan. The first time the words propaganda and film is used in the same sentence is this.
One thing about this film, it brought together the energies of Booker T. Washington, William Monroe Trotter, and W.E.B. Du Bois. Washington, Du Bois, and Trotter recognized that they were dealing with a very new style of propaganda. So one of the efforts was to try to get it shut down.
The fledgling NAACP undertakes a desperate campaign of sending letters and telegraphs to censorship boards, demanding a halt to the film's rollout.
Birth of a Nation comes out around the same time of the birth of the NAACP. They use this to sort of formulate a language of civil rights. In other words, they're cutting their teeth as an organization on this film that is so racist that has them say, well, wait a minute, we have to do something about this.
Afraid that growing resistance may weaken box office profits, Griffith boards the train to the nation's capital to consolidate support for his picture. He crosses a nation deeply divided by the color lines of Jim Crow. By the time his train pulls into Washington, D.C., the Klansman has been renamed The Birth of a Nation.
Dixon apparently suggested the title to Griffith rather than the Klansman. This idea of the America recreated out of the victory over Reconstruction, which means, ipso facto, without question, a white supremacist nation. It's the birth of the new white supremacy.
The first time I saw Birth of a Nation in its entirety was here, 41 East 7th Street. That's where the old NYU Graduate Film School was. And they showed the film. Oh, they talked about how the great techniques that D.W. Griffith had invented. I asked some questions. I don't think the instructor liked the direction or the intention. That really turned into my first year film. My film was called The Answer, and it's about a young black writer-director who's hired by a major studio to do a remake of Birth of a Nation. I took the most offensive scenes from that film and put them in my film, The Answer. The lead would rather commit suicide, plunge to her death, than be touched by a black man. I didn't have a problem with them showing the film, but they left out that film was, amongst many other things, that was used as a recruiting tool by the Klan. They just said that he's the father of cinema, and it's a great film, and watch it. No context whatsoever.
In early 1915, when the movie was coming out, being the 50th anniversary of the Civil War, Thomas Dixon and Griffith arranged to screen the film in the White House before President Wilson. Projectionists wore tuxedos. It was a very formal affair. And it was the first ever screening of a film inside the White House.
News that President Wilson will embrace D.W. Griffith's and Thomas Dixon's racial propaganda adds insult to the injury of the newly enacted segregation laws sweeping the country. The president agrees to view the picture as a personal favor to Dixon, his close friend since their college days at Johns Hopkins University.
In fact, Thomas Dixon was actually part of this political cohort that helped create the political career of Woodrow Wilson.
And Dixon was a marketing master. So he understood the real PR value of showing this film very early to the President of the United States. And he and Griffith also knew, Wilson was a historian. He had written a multi-volume work on American history.
D.W. Griffith quotes from Woodrow Wilson's book on Reconstruction right in the movie.
In 1902, Woodrow Wilson writes, "What congressional policy wrought upon the South was the overthrow of civilization in the South by putting the white South under the heel of black rule." That's Woodrow Wilson.
Woodrow Wilson, Thomas Dixon, D.W. Griffith, these guys were all children of Reconstruction, and their early adulthood became the immediate post-Reconstruction South.
Here you have this 3+ hour epic drama which portrays blacks as beasts, in effect. And it's playing in the White House, and everyone there thought it was a terrific piece of work. Wilson seemed, by all accounts, to just soak it all up, was flattered, and was credited when the film ended as saying, "This is telling history as lightning."
That's a genius description of the movie. Lightning, meaning it's not just the electricity that is required to make a film, it also has an excitement. It had the power of the medium at its fullest and had an incredible message, and that message was horrifically racist. And then it had the endorsement of the White House to take it even further.
With a presidential seal of approval, Griffith prepares to open his epic in New York City on March 3, 1915, at the Liberty Theater on 42nd Street.
The Liberty Theatre in New York is very careful, and they will not sell tickets to African Americans. They know that if you do have some kind of racial altercation, if a fight breaks out, then maybe you might be able to get the film banned. So you've got to dampen that down.
Despite the NAACP's best efforts, the film is seen by thousands in its first few weeks of exhibition. And The Birth of a Nation becomes the most successful film during the silent film era.
But there's a huge amount of effort from the NAACP. Doesn't work.
And then it's headed to Boston. And that's Trotter's hometown. Trotter felt, we have to meet it. We have to meet it head on.
Trotter, once regarded as too radical, is now the last hope to stop the film.
Every performance heaps new, undeserved ignominy upon the Negro race. We think it should be stopped at once.
If you were William Monroe Trotter in 1915, you'd seen the Plessy versus Ferguson decision in your lifetime. You'd seen the tide of social progress moving backward. When you see Birth of a Nation, people like Monroe Trotter can look at this film and they say, this is exactly what we are fighting against.
Griffith and his people, they were gearing up for a fight because there was a well-organized history of civil rights in Boston. The feeling among the filmmakers, if we can get the film through Boston, we can play it anywhere.
In 1915 Boston, censorship power resides in the office of James Curley, arguably the most powerful mayor in the city's history. Curley is a crusader of civic virtue, banning entertainment he finds morally and politically reprehensible.
You have to understand, a few years earlier, the play The Klansman came to Boston. And Trotter demanded this play be closed down, and it was. So from Trotter's point of view, He expected that the political structure would, again, do the same thing.
We hope to not let a day elapse before we request censors to act.
Trotter is a newspaper man, and he's the kind of guy, at first blush, you would think would be wrapping himself up in free expression, free press arguments of the First Amendment, but here he is seeking to suppress expression. And that seems paradoxical until you understand the dynamic at the time. Censorship wasn't the bugaboo that we think of it today. In the core of his argument, the First Amendment is not without limits. This is expression that is so offensive to Black America that it should not be seen.
Trying to head off the fight coming to his city, Curley convenes a hearing. For the first time, William Monroe Trotter and David Wark Griffith meet in person.
Griffith, in his defense of the movie, there's no indication that he really understood why they were so offended. How can he be so blind? Because here he is, even in these hearings over censorship, talking to people like William Monroe Trotter, or in other instances, Du Bois. Brilliant, accomplished men who shatter the portrayals and the stereotypes that he has in his film.
Through his editorials, Trotter campaigned heavily for Curley, helping him win the Black vote. Trotter thinks Curley owes him a favor.
Trotter simply tells Curley that, look, we voted for you last time, but how you do on this is how we might judge you next time.
Unlike Trotter, Griffith has the backing of the White House. He is confident Curley will not ban his film.
Curley, at the end of the hearing, asked Griffith if he would voluntarily trim one of the most controversial scenes, the so-called Gus chase scene. When it came to these sort of race hot button moments, he would tinker with it, trim a little bit, and then put it back. But the bottom line is that there were no substantive changes to the work.
We have these horrifying scenes that even still today play as horrifying. Gus has almost raped little sister Flora. She's gone off the cliff, and it's this very dramatic moment. There's a trial by the KKK, and they decide that he's guilty. Even though there's years and years separating us, you can still see why this is such a horrifying moment.
Griffith's view in going to Boston and defending the film had a couple of elements to it. First of all, he was convinced that it was historically accurate. The other big argument was that as he became America's pioneering film director, he was elevating the medium to art and warrants First Amendment protection as free expression. The First Amendment back then, it didn't truly extend to arts and culture in the way that we know it today.
D.W. Griffith proposes this kind of inverted victimhood. Out of that, he becomes convinced that his rights to free speech are being curtailed. He produces this pamphlet, The Rise and Fall of Free Speech in America. He is completely oblivious that his work has been complicit in curtailing the very right to live among a whole other set of people. Certainly on the scale of who is in jeopardy here, it is not D.W. Griffith.
Frustrated by his failure to obtain City Hall's legal sanctions, Trotter prepares for direct action in the streets.
The policy of compromise has failed. The policy of agitation and resistance deserves a trial.
The Boston protest was multi-pronged. Trotter and local leaders of the NAACP, they went down to the theater. The ticket office was discriminating in ticket sales and wasn't selling tickets to blacks who were curious and wanted to see the movie. Word got out. Police superintendent had more than 100 uniformed officers stationed nearby and out of sight around the corner. A little after 7, Trotter comes marching in, and he's with dozens and dozens of supporters. Trotter and his contingent, they go into the lobby and try to get a ticket. Trotter demands a ticket. One of the officers in plain clothes, he sucker punches Trotter. Trotter placed under arrest and dragged out of the lobby.
But some of Trotter's followers manage to sneak into the theater, and the screening turns ugly. Boos and hisses grow louder until finally eggs fly from the audience and splatter across the screen.
There are several thousand protesters turning out in Boston Common against this movie. On this particular night, they're at the movie theater. On another day, they're marching to the State House to appeal to the governor to intervene. It's the kind of thing that you end up scratching your head and going, what year is this? 1915? This is so 1960-ish. And yet here it is, Monroe Trotter at the forefront of this mass demonstration and protest that the journalists are writing about. They hadn't seen anything like this.
News of the Boston protests and Trotter's arrest is reported in cities all across the country. Following his release from jail, Trotter galvanizes support and electrifies the crowd with a speech at Faneuil Hall.
If there is any lynching here in Boston, Mayor Curley will be responsible.
The excitement of protests builds as Trotter leads a march on the State House.
3,000 African Americans walking up those tight streets of Beacon Hill, singing hymns.
One of the protesters remembers the moment.
I look over the vast crowd of Negro men and women, and the thought came to me. This is a united people, and although in the minority now, they are going to win. All the black leaders coming together, Washington, Du Bois, Trotter, forgetting their differences. 10 million Negroes would be united. A nation would really be born.
Trotter appealed to the governor, who backs Trotter's bid to amend the censorship law and take sole power away from Mayor Curley. They are confident they can line up 2 votes on the new 3-person board to ban the film. Massive street protests continue as Trotter and his supporters pack the State House.
Trotter is designing the kind of campaign of civil protest and disobedience which is going to take off in the 20th century in the long civil rights movement.
After 3 weeks of mounting tension and packed rallies, the new censorship board retires behind closed doors. To the protesters' dismay, Curley alone emerges to read a curt statement. The license of the theater should not be revoked or suspended. The film will play in Boston.
What Trotter did was to show that mass mobilization was possible, that black people were a coherent group. They could get angry about demeaning images being shown, but unfortunately, everything they did seemed to only create larger audiences for Birth of a Nation. They did the right thing. They had to voice protests against this vile, racist work of art. You can't censor. It was never going to work, and it didn't work.
At the close of the film, the Ku Klux Klan is presented as the heroes. They are the saviors, the ones who come riding to the rescue. Great piece of propaganda.
Trotter's worries did come true. In early December 1915, when it did open and was shown in Atlanta, Georgia, it inspired the rebirth of the Klan. Within days, on Stone Mountain, a new Klan came together, burned a cross. William J. Simmons, who was the leader of that outfit, later wrote about how the movie inspired him to act that way.
By the 1920s, the Ku Klux Klan was larger than it had ever been before, larger than it ever would be after. They even had a march in Washington. They were in full regalia, but their faces weren't covered. So the anonymity, which was a hallmark of the Klan, was not even necessary.
I think the real tragedy of Birth of a Nation is that it really was a great film. It was a huge, spectacular film. And I don't think that we can look at our history truthfully unless we acknowledge that some of our greatest cultural products have also been some of our worst. Spectacular and great things are done with evil intent and have evil effects. But that's just part of history. If we want to really look at history and not just fantasize about what our history should have been in the way that Thomas Dixon did and D.W. Griffith did, then we have to acknowledge even the parts of our history that we don't like. It would be silly not to recognize D.W. Griffith as a great filmmaker simply because he made a racist film.
Well, racism is racism. I mean, no matter what form it is, whether it be Al Jolson, blackface, and jazz singer, Birth of a Nation, and you can know it when you see it. So it's just different forms, and it's been slickified and hidden, but it's there. Even though they might want to call him a father of cinema, well, call him racist father of cinema. Father of racist cinema, that's even better.
The most dangerous thing about Birth of a Nation was its huge financial success. Because at the end of the day, Hollywood works on precedent. Whether people know better or not, they're going to go back to tropes that they feel are associated with success. You have Birth of a Nation, which is very successful, and you go, okay, America loves racism. They will pay money to see racism on screen. Then you have Gone with the Wind, which is the same racist tropes. Bam, that becomes a huge success. I knew it. This racism thing works. Those same ideas keep repeating through the entire history of cinema.
The NAACP recognized the importance of fighting back, but failed to make their own film countering the racist ideas of Birth of a Nation. It would be left to the independent black filmmaker Oscar Micheaux to produce and direct Within Our Gates, an answer to the negative stereotypes in Griffith's film.
When Micheaux made his film, he showed a black family who were being lynched, cross-cut with their daughter, who is a mulatto woman, who is being attacked by a white male.
Ironically, many cities that exhibit the Birth of a Nation censor Micheaux's film for fear it will incite racial violence.
The legacy of Birth of a Nation is that at least it canonizes, to some extent, black resistance to cinema that many African Americans found to be offensive.
One significant thing about the battle against Birth of a Nation is that it was a two-pronged attack, both in terms of trying to get changes in the legislative process to legally ban the film or censor it, and also the direct action approach, taking to the streets. Those two approaches continued, I think, to be part of the civil rights movement.
This movie that was so controversial became an organizing vehicle for what became the nation's most prominent civil rights organization. But Trotter was not on that train. He had a fundamental philosophical difference with the NAACP that boiled down to this. In those early years, the NAACP, the top officers were white men. And it was Trotter's view that a civil rights organization for the advancement of black America had to be run by blacks.
As Birth of a Nation steamrolls the country, Booker T. Washington dies. Although the mantle of civil rights leadership passes directly to W.E.B. Du Bois and the NAACP, it is William Monroe Trotter who laid the foundation stone for the battles of the modern civil rights movement to come.
William Monroe Trotter was a necessary element in the radicalization of the American Negro leadership. Even in the motto for his newspaper, for every right, comma, with all thy might. Trotter was edgy, and he lived on that edge, and he died on that edge.
Trotter begins to spiral out of control after Deanie dies of the Spanish flu. Deanie was really everything to him. She was really instrumental in keeping the newspaper going. I can only imagine he looked back on his life, and what he had hoped never really came to be, and wouldn't for decades.
Oh, glory, 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 hallelujah.
William Monroe Trotter had earned the respect of many of those he'd befriended and battled. W.E.B. Du Bois would say of his old university companion, Monroe Trotter was a man of historic proportion, ready to sacrifice himself, fearing nobody and nothing, strong in body, sturdy in conviction, full of unbending belief.